Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. And today I want to be just looking over and reviewing a history of Ireland from Celts to English rule. This is my second time watching, probably third time now, probably watching up this video. No, second time watching this video. And when I was watching it the first time around, I had a lot of grievances. There were a lot of things I disagreed with. I don't think he goes completely off the rails and this is a fantasy interpretation. I don't think that's the case at all in this video. However, there's a lot of bits in here that I do massively disagree with his interpretation. And also, I was just scrolling down here as well and I noticed there was no sources in here. So I'm not quite sure where this information is coming from. Like, what books is he getting his information from? Like, what, so I'm not sure why he's got this interpretation the way it is. Obviously, down below in the comment section, in the descriptions, I'll be posting a link to his video. And I would, because this is me going through the video, I would advise for you to watch his video first so you get the full picture of what I'm talking about before you watch my video, this video here, because I'm just going to be cutting bits out and dissecting it, not with a fine comb or anything, just from a perspective, treat it as like I'm watching it for the first time and I'm adding commentary. I'm not going to be there with a pen and paper going through everything. So without further ado, let's go through the information. And that's pretty good. Like, that opening there is quite good, in the fact that this is all new information that's coming in. Like, even yesterday we had all that stuff, is sudden excitement of what was going on. So this here I do agree with. So there are a good bit of this video I do agree with. It's just with certain interpretation I just think it's way out there and I do disagree with. You see, this is where it's quite funny, and I would like him to elaborate on what he means by that, because I did find it funny that he recognizes the Tuat system as there, but he doesn't kind of talk about it from a confederacy. Like, he highlights the actual pyramid scheme that was there, but he then goes on, what's going on here? Like, can he just a wee bit elaborate on what he means by them being all fragment? Because they have an overking on top of them. And it is true that they are kind of competing amongst themselves, especially during cattle raiding season. So he neither elaborates on cattle raiding season, and he also doesn't elaborate on the Nail. I've watched this video before, and never in this whole video does he talk about the Nail and their overkingship and what their overkingship meant. So I would love more elaboration on this and where he got the information for this from, because he's not wrong. He just doesn't build up on that, and then he says, oh well, this is why Ireland is so fragmented. That's true, because it's the medieval period. On top of that, this is the early medieval period. So having a man who owns land and then having an overking over him is common all over the place, including England. England has no form of centralization until 1066. And I know every person who is a pro-English fan in the comment section will be like, oh, but Alfred did this and Edmund did that. That's great, but when they passed away, all of their sons and their competitors in Wessex and Northumbria straight away rose up and went against them. So they may as well have had just the same title as any other overking. You don't really get a true sense of centralized kingship until you have William the Conqueror and his Doomsday Book and the way his son succeeded him. That's when you get proper succession going on. So I can't see Ireland being any different to the rest of Europe with their barons and landlords, that the moment there's a position to compete, they're there to compete for that land, including committing mortal combat to do so, So straight away, he has Meath, so you could argue that the southern Nail are there, but the northern Nail are missing. They have the Ullid, which only dominates the eastern side of the Ulster territory, but the rest of that is dominated and then further divides again between the O'Neills and the O'Donnells. But a good chunk of the Northern Nail territory is missing.
Yet, in reality, there were many more kingdoms in Ireland at the time. They were constantly at war with each other, breaking apart or conquering one another.
But that's the same throughout all of Europe in the medieval period. This whole idea of constant anarchy is quite silly, I believe, especially when this isn't total war. This is cattle raiding season. So that's the culture in Ireland. It's a culture I like about medieval Ireland, but that doesn't mean there's complete chaos on the island,
There were no clear borders, and the power of the kingdoms depended
But that's the same with all of Europe. All of Europe, there's no clear borders. We're dealing with the medieval period. You can't highlight that enough,
entirely on the abilities of their kings. Because of this, throughout their history, the Irish were never able to unite against common enemies or invaders.
I 100% disagree with that. We'll see how his interpretation of the Viking Age is, but throughout the early medieval period, there are plenty of leaders that come together and settle grievances or problems depending on what the situation is. Turn around and saying, hey, look, this island is on complete chaos 24/7. Definitely, once again, I'd love to know where this information is coming from.
The alliances they formed were short-lived. The numerous kings of Ireland would quickly recall old conflicts and begin fighting one another, with some even choosing to ally with the invaders. The situation would continue to plague Ireland throughout the Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, Ireland was protected from invaders by the fact that European kingdoms simply lacked the fleets to reach the island. On the other hand,
or perhaps they weren't pushing into them. I noticed you did a little bit on the Dalriada, but you didn't do much on the Irish pushing into Roman territory and raiding them. Ireland just had the superior ships at the time, perhaps. Especially when we were stealing Roman ships and copying them. But more archaeological study would have to be done into that.
Soon, Viking raiders appeared in the seas of Europe.
And he talks about a lack of unification, but doesn't talk about the Aeneal. Does not elaborate on the Aeneal.
Challenging even the most powerful kings. The Vikings also sailed to Ireland. Already in 795, they plundered a monastery on Lambay Island. In the following years, they raided Ulster and Connacht, and by 820, the Vikings had looted almost the entire coastline of Ireland. The Irish referred to the Vikings as Gael, meaning
that's Gaul, right? Gaul is just there for the Vikings that, believe it or not, that had become a part of the society. So that's where you get the word Gallo-Glass from. And these are, especially the Gaul Gael, were the ones that mixed in with society. So you had the Norse Vikings and you had the Danish Vikings who came and assimilated, and you have the Northmen. But you also have the Vikings that were neither Gaelic, native Irish, but they weren't really, they weren't Norse, they weren't English, they were kind of in between the worlds. And so they get referred to as foreigner, Gael. It's the same thing with Welsh. Welsh is the same play on words as foreigner as well. So they're not native, they're not part of our society, but they're a part of the foreign society, So this word doesn't actually apply at the Norse Vikings. So just a little bit of a correction there. These would be referred to as what we would call today as like Irish Vikings or Oostmen later on. They would refer to as Oostmen later on. So these people are the, from an academic standard, the Hiberno-Scandinavians.
Foreigner. In 837, a large Viking war band, led by King Turgesius, arrived in Ireland.
4,000 troops. Did he actually have 4,000 troops? Very questionable. Very large force. I think from the sources I was looking at, he may have had 120. But it is in the realm of possibility he may have had 4,000 troops. But yeah, Turgis is an interesting...
Historians are unsure who this king was, as he is not mentioned in Scandinavian sagas. Even so, Irish chronicles provide a detailed account of his campaign. He invaded Ulster and captured the city of Armagh, the center of Christianity.
Once he captured Armagh, I would say he would sacked the outskirts of Armagh. It'd be a difficult, mean feat for him to get inside of there. But if you're planning to hit 4,000 troops to do it, possibly. Remember, Turgis doesn't win a single battle against the Irish. Look at the annals. Go through it yourself. He doesn't win a single battle against the Irish. In fact, he loses every single battle against the Irish.
In Ireland. The Vikings looted the cathedral, and they sacrificed captured Irish people to Odin on the ruins of the cathedral. Afterward, Turgesius...
The ruins of the cathedral? Huh? That's very, very questionable. Armagh still stands today, so, and Claire Downham also questions a lot of this stuff as well, people who would go on about this being in ruins. How is it that they're in ruins, but the following day they're praying back at it again, They rebuild it very, very quickly, don't they? As a lot of historians are questioning other historians who have this interpretation of it being in ruins. I do believe they sacked and looted, all right. But then there's the question of, are they looting and sacking the outside area? Are they actually penetrating in? And then when they do get in, how much destruction are they causing?
This did not leave the island, but sailed south and settled with his forces at the mouth of the river Liffey. There, the Vikings built their settlement, which they named Dublin. In Irish, Dubhlin, meaning Blackpool, in 840. From Dublin, Turgesius began launching raids deeper into the island, utilizing the rivers along which the Vikings' longships could sail. During one of these raids, he encountered the King of Mead, Mael Shecnol I. According to legend,
Yeah, it's interesting. So he refers to the Over-King of Ireland at the time as just the King of Mead. Is this deliberate? Like, what's going on here? And he'll openly highlight here that the King of Mead had defeated Turgis in this battle. So very, very questionable. I'm not even sure the title King of Mead existed at that specific time. I'm sure he's just referred to as the King of Tara, which is, meant to symbolize his over-kingship of Ireland at the time. However, he did turn around and say that Tara doesn't exist anymore at this point. So, what's going on here? Funny. But then he's got Tara highlighted here. But it should be Clonmacnoise. Clonmacnoise is actually the main centre to Mael Shecnol I. So a few mistakes here, and then his ultimate argument is that he refuses to recognise Mael Shecnol as the Over-King of Ireland. So he's in this video, he is refusing to recognise over-kingship of Ireland, and he's refusing to recognise the Northern Inal as well. Okay, so that's quite interesting, because his main argument is that the Irish don't unify, the island is under complete and utter chaos. That's the argument of the video.
The Irish king asked the Viking king what should be done about the troublesome birds living nearby. Turgesius advised the king to destroy their nests. Mael Shecnol followed this advice, and that night, the Irish launched a surprise attack on the Viking camp, killing them all. King Turgesius was captured and executed in captivity. After this, Mael Shecnol focused on expelling the Vikings from the island, defeating their armies. He even received the title of High King of Ireland, becoming the first king whose existence is confirmed in the Chronicle.
Okay. Yeah, I do agree with that bit. So he does actually go on and elaborate on Mael Shecnol being recognised as, in his words, as High King of Ireland, Ardria. However, in his over in Clonmacnoise, he's recognised as King of Ireland. you're then going into the debate of decentralization versus centralization, which is even a deeper conversation again. Now, is he the first one to do it? I would say Philmid was the first one to do it down in Munster. So I would say the King of Munster around 836 is the first one to be recognised during the Viking Age as King of Ireland. Of course, then you've got the periods before then. You have Diarmid MacCurbal, characters like that during the Golden Age of Ireland between 550 all the way to 793, and then before 550 again you've got various other people that could be recognised as an over King of Ireland. So also on top of that as well, he also left out the fact that Mael Seachna I actually hired Gaul mercenaries. So he uses the word Gaul, aka Irish Vikings, but he doesn't talk about or elaborate the fact he's hiring these people into his military. So he has an interpretation at me that's very kind of Irish versus Viking. So that's quite funny as well.
Even though, once again, the political fragmentation of Ireland played a role, Mael Seachna had to fight not only against the Vikings, but also against other Irish kings, which prevented the Irish from uniting against the new group of Scandinavian invaders. In 853, Dublin...
This is coming throughout all of Europe, by the way. It's not a case, I know his main argument is, why does he need to highlight and bring this up? I do question this because we see this throughout all of Europe. His constant attack is, the Irish are fragmented, they're barbaric, the Irish are fragmented, Why is this constantly being brought up? Why do we have to have this idea that Ireland is unique because it's got 150 landholders that have a semi-independent power on the island that keep competing amongst each other, like it's unique in the rest of Europe?
Dublin was captured by King Olaf the White, or, according to Irish chronicles, King Aulib. He also became the first king of Dublin. Olaf began raiding both inland Ireland and Great Britain. His largest raid took place in 870, when he plundered the Welsh kingdom of Strathclyde. After Olaf's death, power passed to his companion, King Eamar, who is commonly identified by modern historians as the semi-legendary Ivar the Boneless. He ruled for a short time and died in a minor skirmish with the Irish.
Okay, so a lot needs to be elaborated on this one as well, is that Mael Seachna and Olaf the White actually played the political game in Ireland. When they were going to war with the Kingdom of Meath, they were also allied with the Northern Nael, who were left out of this, and trying to get that kingship in there. They were always trying to get kingships that favoured them, because the men of Dublin, as they're referred to in the annals at this point, are constantly trying to make maximum profit. And to make maximum profit, they need an over kingship of Ireland that supports them. So of course they're going to support that over kingship that supports them making a lot of money through their slave trade in the island of Ireland. If they have an over kingship that's not agreeing with their political gain, they're going to work with other tuits that also have grievances with whoever the over king is at the time, and try to try to have him usurped. But this is common throughout all of Europe. Ireland is no different.
Irish in 873. Eamar's descendants inherited the throne of Dublin and began to assimilate into Irish traditions.
Well, to be fair, he did actually say that, He doesn't elaborate on that, but he does, indicate and point it out.
Despite the fact that the Kingdom of Dublin was small, it possessed a powerful fleet, which allowed it to intervene in any other kingdoms on the island. The city itself grew through trade and became the main port in Ireland. The Vikings of this kingdom actively participated in Irish politics, conducted raids on Scotland and England. The Iver dynasty, descendants of Eamar, also settled in the Kingdom of Jorvik until it was conquered by the English. Certainly, not all the Irish were pleased with the presence of the Vikings on the island. The first attempt to expel the Vikings was the King of Leinster, Carol MacMuiracán. He united the Irish and in 902 AD captured Dublin. Even so, once the Vikings left the island, the Irish kings began to quarrel again and resumed fighting among themselves.
Well, kingship then passes over to Niall Glundov, so I wouldn't say that the island just broke into complete chaos after the death of Flann Sinna. Also on top of that, Flann Sinna is the Overking of Ireland at the time. He's recognised as King of Ireland. His literal title he gives himself is Flann over Ireland. Diarmid, who's down in Leinster, had an on and off again relationship with Dublin. However, after Brodor Eamer's death, there's a King of Dublin who just has a falling out with everybody, and he gets bounced. And the entire Eamer dynasty gets bounced out of Dublin. The thing is that just the dynasty gets booted out. Archaeology evidence has completely pointed out that there is no change in the archaeological finds of this period, which goes to show that only the dynasty, the nobles, were kicked out of Dublin. The rest of the Hiberno-Scandinavian population inside of Dublin stayed. Which makes sense. You need people to continue the administration that's going on in Dublin, because this is a very complicated administration that's going on at the time, because it's linked to a massive trade network at this point, going from Iceland all the way over to Baghdad and then going further still over to China. So, you kind of want somebody who knows what they're doing, so you're not going to kick them out. But you are going to kick out the nobles you disagree with.
When, 15 years later, the Vikings retook Dublin, the Irish tried once more to stop them, but suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Conwy, also known as the Battle of Cien Fuich. Not only did the Vikings regain Dublin, but they also captured several new cities in Ireland, including Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick. Bigger successes were achieved by Brian Boru from the small kingdom of Thomond.
So he kind of massively skipped ahead here and went past the complicated politics that was going on between Dun Olaf III, and also the complicated relationship between Conglock and Amleth Ciaran. Conglock and Amleth Ciaran were actually very, very close with each other. And when both Amleth Ciaran and Conglock have rebellions in their realm, Amleth Ciaran comes over from York back to Dublin to try to quell all of these rebellions with the Overking of Ireland at the time. And this finally comes to a massive conclusion at the Battle of Slane around 944. So he kind of skips a lot of the massive battles and stuff in Ireland, but I suppose he wants to go back into the narrative of Viking versus Irish, rather than the Eamers being like any other Irish dynasty in Ireland, or any other Irish nobility on the island of Ireland. That ultimately, except for the fact they were making a lot of profit at the time, there was nothing special to them. They were all under the Overking of Ireland.
Brian was a skilled military leader and had a talent for politics. Since his youth, when his father was killed by the Vikings, he swore to expel the foreigners from Ireland. Using diplomacy and some
much more later interpretation, to be quite honest with you. At the time, he did have a huge disagreement with Limerick. At this point, Limerick was independent from Dublin, and it was under the Onochta. So the Onochta in Cashel and Limerick were against the Dal Cash, which were Brian Boru's to it.
Sometimes brute force, Brian united the province of Munster under his rule, and then attacked.
He said united. He didn't say the fact that he usurped the Onochta.
The Vikings who had settled in the west of Ireland. He defeated them at the Battle of Sulcoit and also captured the city of Limerick. After this, the new King of Munster began to extend his power over the rest of the island. In response, the Vikings and several Irish kings formed an alliance against him. They attempted to stop Brian. But in 999 AD, They were defeated at the Battle of Glenmama.
Highlighting the fact that Brian Boru was trying to usurp Mael Shocknall II. That's why they were unifying against him.
Thanks to this victory, Brian Boru expanded his territories, and the Irish looted and burned Dublin. In 1002, Brian Boru firmly consolidated his power over the island when the powerful Yell clan submitted to him, and Brian was crowned the High King of Ireland.
That's him now in 1002. That's him successfully usurped the kingship of the Yell. Okay, so we need to highlight that fact that Brian Boru is a usurper. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge Brian Boru supporter. You know, I'm from Munster, but I'm not silly. He is going against the Yell. His ultimate goal is not to kick the Vikings out of Dublin. You know, that he never does that. In fact, he's actually related to Sihtric Silkenbeard. Why would he kick his own relation out? You know, he's going against Sihtric Silkenbeard, don't get me wrong, but he's also related to Sihtric Silkenbeard, and Sihtric Silkenbeard brings a lot of money into Ireland. You know, why would you stop that?
In 1014, the Vikings of Dublin, with the support of their Irish allies and mercenaries from the Kingdom of the Isles, attempted to fight against Brian Boru once more. The armies met at Clontarf. According to the chronicles, the battle lasted the entire day, and over 100 kings and chieftains were killed. In total, more than 10,000 warriors died. Only at night did the Vikings, unable to withstand the pressure from the Irish, begin to flee the battlefield. Brian Boru achieved his third great victory over the Vikings, but he himself was killed in the battle. Despite the fact that Brian did not manage to completely drive the Vikings out of Ireland, his victories undermined the power of their kingdom in Dublin. The Vikings lost their influence on the island and began to assimilate rapidly. The Scandinavians in Ireland became most renowned as mercenary warriors, the Galloglasses. The weakened Kingdom of Dublin did not remain under Viking rule for long. The last Scandinavian to rule Dublin, Gofrid Olafsson, managed to hold power for only 3 years before the Irish finally seized control.
Before the Irish finally took control. So funny interpretation, especially when he was a Hiberno-Scandinavian, and in places like Iceland would have been recognized like any other Irish person. He's also referred to as Ustman, meaning like an Eastern Irishman. So at that point, to refer to him as, you know, any other foreigner, like a Norse foreigner or something, is quite strange. And I don't think even when the Gaelic dynasties like the Ibrahim and stuff take over, it's not a case of, oh, we're kicking the Vikings out. It's a case of the Ibrahim's taking over the administration of Dublin. And this is under Diarmid MacMail na Mór as well, and his administration that was going on in there. So I think this is more like dynasties taking over rather than a case of Gaelic versus Viking.
Although the Irish fought bravely, their forces were made up of foot soldiers with light weaponry, and therefore could not withstand the English knights.
Okay, so I just want to highlight the fact that in this period, Ireland has a lot of riveted mail finds, and we also have arrowheads that are specifically designed to take on riveted mail, which further indicates that the war style of this period is heavy. So there is a lot of heavy units in there. So to turn around and saying that the Irish are too light of infantry, it's true that we have kerns who do specialize in light infantry tactics of not wearing mail and constantly skirmishing and harassing the enemy, and that's what they specialize in. That's what they're very much elite at. And that's because of the rough terrain that gives them a huge advantage. These same tactics would not work in England. They wouldn't work in France because the terrain isn't rough enough to give these light infantry an advantage. However, to turn around and say that the Irish lacked riveted mail and lacked the ability to take it on is incorrect. The Irish lost because the Irish didn't have these Norman knights that dominated the battlefields of England, dominated the battlefields of southern Scotland, dominated the battlefield of France, dominated the Middle East, dominated Turkey, dominated all over the world. The Norman Knight was dominant. It was a wrecking ball that was going through everything. That's why the Normans are beating. The Normans will win again and again and again until eventually the Irish adjust to this style of warfare. And they do. They eventually do actually adjust to this style of warfare before the whole island is taken over. So don't be afraid of that. But they are losing battles because these Norman Knights are just flanking and smashing through the formations during battle.
According to the agreement, Ireland was divided into two parts: the English-controlled lands, held by English lords, and the Irish-controlled lands, ruled by Ruaidhrí and the native Irish kings. Instead of swearing fealty as a vassal, the High King was required only to pay tribute to the English. Not surprisingly, no one intended to honor that treaty either. So, after a series of clashes, in 1177 Henry made another attempt to strengthen his authority by proclaiming his youngest son, John, as King of Ireland. Yet, the new king first visited the island only in 1185, and the trip was a failure. John quarreled with the Irish kings, they rose in rebellion, and he was forced to flee. It wasn't until 1210 that John returned with an army and restored English control over the island.
Okay, so I recognize what these lines are supposed to be. Yeah, I massively disagree, of course, with this interpretation. Of course, the problem here is that many of these kings completely are independent from the English crown from the get-go. So obviously these lines are quite funny. It would be grand if you elaborated more. This whole thing of he took control, like these are Gaelic that are subjugated by the English. I think not, especially when you have the McCarthys who are, as he even pointed out in the Battle of Thurles, the McCarthys have successfully beaten back the Norman invasion multiple times now, and so are the O'Briens as well. So I hugely disagree with this, and that's never mind talking about the success that the O'Neills are having. Like this period sees the rise of the O'Neill clan. So also massive disagreement there. And don't forget that Rory O'Connor is recognised as the King of Ireland as well on top of that. So I definitely disagree with all this. And also on top of that, when he turned around and says that John came in and he brought back stability, I think Hugh de Lacy definitely disagrees with that, since he bullied and kicked them out of the island. But I notice he doesn't highlight that in the video. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff here I disagree with.
The most powerful Irish clan became the O'Neills, who held out against English rule longer than any other.
Yeah, you see, this is why I think there definitely needs to be elaboration on that, because he has no problems pointing out the O'Neills and the O'Briens and the McCarthys later on. So I'm not quite sure what he means by all these funny stripes that popped up early on in the video about here. So that this definitely needs more elaboration on. You know, are these people who are subjugated in the period of the 1200s, and then they disappear about here when you have more expansion of the likes of the Bergs and the Fitzgeralds and stuff. So what's going on here? Do you know?
It seemed that after the failure of this campaign, no one would be able to drive the English out of Ireland.
I think the Irish have no problems at this point. So he highlights the Scottish War of Independence that's happening here, but at the same time we're starting to see the Gaelic resurgence really pick up at this point. The O'Connors were quite successful at beating the Bergs, although they do lose one of the major battles. However, the O'Briens are massively successful at the Battle of Dyce or Dee, so I massively disagree with this point. The Gaelic resurgence is really starting to pick up because of the Scottish War of Independence. So I think the Irish are quite confident at this point. Also, in around 1250, we had a military revolution happening on the island of Ireland, where at this point we now have access to Norman Knights. We now have access to Gallowglass, which he talked about much more early on. We have access, obviously, to the Kerns I was saying earlier, and and at this point we have a military that that is winning battles. We're winning the Battle of Dyce or Dee. We're winning, as you said, the Battle of Thurles. They're winning battles against the Normans, but at the same time, the Normans are also winning battles against the Irish. So it's very mixed results here. But to turn around and say, hey, look, the Irish are subjugated, they're in a very losing state, something I do disagree with, especially after the Scottish War of Independence.
But in the mid-14th century, the bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, swept across Europe. It reached Ireland in 1348. The different lifestyles of the English and the Irish played a key role during the epidemic. The English lived mainly in towns and cities, while the Irish lived in rural villages. Since the plague struck hardest in urban areas, most of the English population in Ireland was wiped out. English settlements were left nearly deserted, and those English who survived the plague often fled the island. By 1360, the English in Ireland were living only in the area around Dublin, where their territory was known as the English Pale, even though on paper they still claimed all of Ireland as their domain.
Okay, so another problem here is, of course, at the time, Henry III does recognise himself as Lord Protector of Ireland. However, he has lost a major amount of territory, but he's kind of skipped ahead a wee bit. After the death of Edward III, England is left in the position where they have to bring in a whole load of taxes, especially after the Black Death with Richard II. And so where England has a failed peasant revolt, as I was saying there, the Gaelic resurgence continues with Art MacMorrough Cavanagh, who has a very terrifying military force that goes around the island quickly gobbling up territory. So because it was much more organised in Ireland, the Gaelic resurgence is continuing its success. The likes of increased tax onto the island is turning a lot of people away from the English. The Black Death has completely ravaged people who were very pro-English at this time, and giving a huge advantage to people that really do believe in the Gaelic resurgence, especially when Gaelic people now are taking up all these jobs and opportunities in the city areas.
Since most of the English population in Ireland had vanished, Irish culture began to flourish once again. This cultural resurgence became known in history as the Gaelic Revival. The English responded with strict prohibitions. In 1367, they issued the Statute of Kilkenny, a set of laws that forbade the English in Ireland from adopting the Irish language, traditions, or customs.
So this was brought in by Lionel Vantwab, and as I was saying, you would think this would calm down the Irish. Instead, it feeds into it. You already have people that don't want to be paying tax, people who clearly saw the English were getting slapped around with the Black Plague, and now the Gaelic are proper stepping up their takeover of the island.
In 1394, King Richard II of England decided to reconquer Ireland. His first campaign met with some success. He managed to capture a number of Irish territories in the south and east of the island.
Don't get me wrong, it did meet with success, but these are Fitzgerald and Butler territories. And actually, Desmond Fitzgerald, the poet Fitzgerald, when Richard II is leaving on his first campaign, he writes a letter actually giving out about Desmond Fitzgerald, because he goes in and attacks Richard II as he's leaving the island. And he writes a letter to him because, Desmond Fitzgerald was allegedly meant to be on the side of the English. And so Richard II is very confused. Is he a wild Irishman or is he an Englishman? So no, I completely disagree. The Desmond Fitzgeralds at this point are firmly, even in the first campaign, solidly against Richard II. He has captured Desmond Fitzgerald, and he blames the Butlers for why he was attacking the English. And also on top of that as well, the Butlers are also taking a lot of independence at the time as well. We can definitely see that much later on with the rise of the White Earl Butler and the actions he takes within the Irish Parliament against Tolbert, but it's a little bit further on.
These lands were granted to his loyal lords, with the Fitzgerald family, who had been in Ireland since Strongbow's invasion in 1170, receiving the largest share.
Yeah, I think they took that. It wasn't a case of them being given that. The Poet Fitzgeralds went in and attacked all those territories. So I don't think he was given that by choice.
The second campaign in Ireland was far less successful. Due to the fact that the English throne was seized by Henry Bolingbroke, Richard was forced to hastily return.
Now, at this point, Art MacMurrough Kavanagh has dissected the military force of the English, which is left out here. Very, very questionable. So, Art MacMurrough Kavanagh has been successful in his campaign against Richard II. Richard II has lost a major part of his military, and what was left of his military when he arrives in Wales leaves him. Henry Bolingbroke is in a far more stronger position because of his actions over in Ireland, the way his military force was falling apart, giving a massive advantage to Henry Bolingbroke. That's was left out, and it's very questionable why that's left out. But if you're making an argument that the Irish are always quarrelling amongst themselves, always fighting amongst themselves, of course you'd leave out Art MacMurrough Kavanagh.
To England. Throughout the 15th century, the English once again had little focus on Ireland. First, they were drawn into the renewed conflict of the 100 Years' War, and later, England was engulfed in the Wars of the Roses.
Okay, so what he's left out here is the Tolbert-Butler feud. So while Tolbert is in France, he's also going over to Ireland as well. And don't get me wrong, the fact he's pinned down in France gives him a huge disadvantage with him trying to reclaim and bring back dominance in Ireland against the White against the White Earl Butler. But that's left out. Once again, very, very interesting why that's left out.
During this civil war, the English lords in Ireland mostly supported the House of York. When the Tudors seized the throne, Ireland became a launch pad for uprisings.
Okay, so he has a very funny interpretation of the Wars of the Roses in Ireland. At the time, the majority of the Anglo-Irish, the likes of the Fitzgeralds, had supported the Yorks, and so did the O'Neills and the O'Briens. So yes, the majority of the Gaelic did support the Yorkists because the Yorkists were planning to allegedly give the Irish more independence within their Irish Parliament and assemblies. So of course most of the Gaelic and the Anglo-Irish were helping the Yorkists usurp the Plantagenets in the Wars of the Roses. And on top of that, you had the Butlers, who were having a feud with the Fitzgeralds at the time, and the Butlers wanted to support the Plantagenets and later on then support the Tudors against the Fitzgeralds, because the Butlers wanted to take over the Irish Parliament and wrestle it back against the Fitzgeralds. At the time, they were fighting over the title Lord Deputy of Ireland. Eventually, by the Irish themselves, the Fitzgeralds would be very successful in the Wars of the Roses in Ireland, and would get that title, not only the title of Lord Deputy of Ireland, but by the Irish themselves, the Fitzgeralds would be referred to as the Great Earl. And on top of that, at the end of the war, when it's a stalemate between the Tudors and the Fitzgeralds, the Tudors would turn around to Henry VII and say that Fitzgeralds were kings all but in name. But this is left out here. Strange.
Most notably the rebellion of Lambert Simnel in 1487 and that of Perkin Warbeck in 1492. In the end, Ireland and the
So these two rebellions, as he puts it, were the Fitzgeralds invading into England, and it would actually lead to the very last battle of the Wars of the Roses, which he didn't point out there, which is very interesting. The very last battle was a Fitzgerald invasion of England and would reach its peak at the Battle of Stokefield, which is the very last battle of the Wars of the Roses, which everyone forgets about. The last battle is a Fitzgerald invasion of England. The Fitzgeralds lose the battle, but once again, very, very interesting. But I suppose it goes against the idea of a more unified Ireland, perhaps? I don't know.
The early 16th century differed little from ancient times. In 1516, English officials described it as follows. Over 60 counties are under the control of enemies of the crown. There rule more than 60 chieftains who call themselves kings, live by war, and obey no one.
Very interesting. A painting of our favourite, Desmond Fitzgerald. You know? He has these pictures up and stuff, and I do wonder, is it this done on purpose because he's trying to make this argument of 150 kingdoms, or at this point 60 kingdoms who are unruly, and that there's no that it's complete anarchy, they're always fighting amongst themselves, and that the English need to come in and civilize the Irish? Is this the argument that's trying to be made here? Because if it is, that would be considered Whig history, and I hope that's not what's going on here.
There are also 30 English lords in Ireland who follow the same Irish ways. Each of them makes war or peace without asking the king's permission. In reality, Ireland had existed in this fragmented state for centuries, and the 16th century brought no real change to the island.
I think there's massive changes happening in the island of Ireland. It starts off as an island that was very dominated by the Fitzgeralds, and then later on it's very much dominated by the O'Neills. So I do think that there is change in the power structure in Ireland of the 16th century. But given that you've skipped so much, I'm not sure where you get your sources from because it's missing here. I am very much questioning the interpretation that's going on here, and I hope it's not a bit of Whig history going on.
But this time it was England that had changed. It had become a centralized state, with the king wielding nearly absolute power. The new king, Henry VIII, intended to extend that same authority over Ireland. At this point, it's worth mentioning the Fitzgerald family. Gerald Fitzgerald, the Earl of Kildare, like many others, fought both against Irish clans and against rival English lords, all while largely ignoring orders.
So the Tudors. Henry VIII has an entire rebellion up in New York to deal with. So of course the Fitzgeralds are crushing what they refer to as rebellions against the Parliament. Like, this is an entire kind of rebellion against the Parliament with the Burghs, so this is Anglo-Irish against Anglo-Irish, so what's going on here?
From London. Because of this, he was twice summoned to the English capital and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The first time in 1526, he spent 4 years there. But after being summoned again in 1534, Gerald never returned. He was imprisoned once more, this time for killing Irishmen loyal to the English crown, and died in the Tower. While Gerald Fitzgerald was imprisoned in the Tower, the Earldom of Kildare was governed by his eldest son, Thomas, better known as Silken Thomas. When rumors reached him that his father had been executed, Thomas raised an army and declared himself King of Ireland, openly defying the English monarch. His forces quickly seized most of the English-held territories in Ireland.
He was unsuccessful taking over Butler territory, from my understanding. Regardless,
Nevertheless, he failed to capture Dublin.
Refer to it as English territory in Ireland is quite funny, since most of these, as he pointed out, were semi-independent from the crown. They recognised the kingship to a certain degree, but these guys are hardly even paying tax to the English crown. It's recognising, but not really. As Henry VII had pointed out, the Fitzgeralds were kings all but name. So Very funny interpretation he has. Very much like they were English, and he said that. He said that in it, and they weren't English at the time. Do you know? They were Anglo-Irish. They were in between the Gaelic world and they were in between the English world as well. So he's got a very old interpretation of what's going on here.
In 1535, he suffered a defeat outside the city walls. Soon after, English troops under Leonard Grey arrived in Ireland and recaptured the Kildare lands. Fitzgerald continued to fight against the royal troops, but suffered several defeats. He had hoped to gain support from the Irish clans, but they did not ally with Thomas. Eventually, at the end of 1535, Fitzgerald surrendered to the royal forces and met the same fate as his father. He was sent to London and executed the following year. The English troops never left Ireland. They marched across the island, forcing Irish rulers to swear.
Okay, so he gets very mixed up on the surrender and regrant. Don't get me wrong, they do the surrender and regrant, but it's not long until a lot of that stuff is thrown into the bin regardless. Also, Desmond Fitzgerald, spends years going against the English crown until eventually we have the Desmond rebellions that kick off. So even within the Anglo-Irish territories, don't get me wrong, the Butlers very much support the Tudors. And that goes back to their connection during the Wars of the Roses. So these whole territories here, yes, of course, would have expanded. But then, of course, there is the surrender and regrant. But at the same time, you don't have a complete conquest. These are slowly but surely taken over during the period of the Tudor conquest of Ireland. So to see this completely taken over in a surrender and regrant, very old-fashioned.
Allegiance to Henry VIII. To consolidate their power over the island, the English confiscated lands from Irish clans and returned them as private property to Irish kings, who now became ordinary landlords. Thus, the O'Neills became Earls of Tyrone, the O'Briens, Earls of Thomond, and the MacBurks, who were originally of English descent but had assimilated, became Earls of Clanricarde. This land policy became known as surrender and regrant, and in 1542, Henry VIII crowned himself King of Ireland, thereby formally securing the English crown's authority over the island.
Definitely did not secure his kingship, especially when the papacy definitely did not recognize this kingship. Remember, only Henry VIII recognizes himself as King of Ireland. Scotland does not recognize that. The papacy definitely doesn't recognize that. And most of Europe doesn't recognize it as well. And most of these lords, earls, etc. also didn't recognize that. Remember, they would have taken that surrender and regrant and then they would have gone back to being independent. And if Henry VIII would have enforced it, they would have, pushed them back out. And this is the entire war that's the Tudor conquest of Ireland, that sees the continued rise of the O'Neills, by the way.
Thus, by the end of the Middle Ages, Ireland, after centuries of fragmentation, had come entirely under English control. Or so the English thought. In reality, a new...
This whole idea that the English have finally conquered Ireland and civilized it through centralization, that last bit, definitely would have to disagree with that, especially when we had the likes, he ignored the likes of Brian Brew, that he even talked about that, but we also had very early on, we had, Diarmid MacCurble during the golden age of Ireland. Then we go into the Viking Age, where we have the likes of Philmid, Mael Shocknall the First, we have Flan Shinna, we have the likes of Donegal Dunn, we have Clonglock, we have then Mael Shocknall the Second, then we have Brian Boru. There is a form of overkingship there that's very similar to the overkingship that we see with the rest of the Western world at the time. It's true, we never get a centralized king in Ireland, but what we do have then is assemblies, and also on top of that as well, we have the Irish Parliament, where we discuss and govern how the island of Ireland is ran. We also have merchants that dominate the economy of Ireland and enrich Ireland into various ways. And of course, more research and study needs to be done into that. But it's very difficult to do that sort of study into saying how successful the merchants of Ireland were during the high and late medieval period, when we constantly just label them as backwards and stupid because they're fragmented, you know? So very, very, very questionable with that statement there.
New chapter of prolonged struggle was about to begin as the Irish continued to rise up in rebellion against the conquerors, relentlessly fighting for their freedom.
Okay, a lot of stuff there. Massive disagreement with the conclusion, of course. The conquerors. Remember, Elizabeth died before the end of the 9 Years' War against Hugh O'Neill, so there's no successful conclusion to the 9 Years' War, which eventually leads to the Irish Rebellion of 1640. Where you've got large part of Ireland that was still ungoverned. Remember, Elizabeth also sent over new English lords over to Ireland that also went very much independent against the Stuarts, because the Stuarts had taken over Ireland, and so many of the new English had no connections with the Stuarts, and so they just went kind of independent, somewhat independent, away from the crown at the time. So of course, you know, it was a recipe for eventual the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, Scotland, Ireland and England. So even with the Irish Rebellion in 1641, that would then bring about not just a rebellion against those that were loyal to the crown, but also rose up many people who were always independent from the crown. And also on top of that, there were lords and earls from across the seas from the papacy who were exiled and kicked out of Ireland during the 9 Years' War, would return. This isn't the only time. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms after Cromwell, because Cromwell then after his death was usurped then against the Stuarts once more, this would lead to even more wars and conflicts with the Jacobite rising and rebellion. So we have these continuous Jacobite wars that would continue all the way over to 1803. So if this was 1803, yeah, I would agree that that's when Ireland is finally subjugated against the crown. However, after the Tudor conquest and no conclusion being brought in, and then it leading to another war again, you know, it leading to another war and another rebellion and another war and another rebellion, all the way up to 1803. No, I massively disagree with this conclusion here at the very end. Also on top of that, his interpretation of a fragmented Ireland, massively disagree. I think he just has a completely different interpretation of what it is to be centralized and for an island to be civilized, perhaps. Yeah, it's a very funny one. I definitely want to know what people's view and interpretation is down below. It's very difficult to elaborate on his thought frame, and if he does make corrections and elaborates on his own interpretation, he can do that because there's nothing to go from. There's no foundations here to go from, which is quite annoying. To be quite honest with you. So if he wants to turn around and say, hey look, I didn't have the interpretation that the English were civilizing the island of Ireland, how the hell do I know? There's nothing here to elaborate on. Why does he constantly push for Ireland was a fragmented island? You know, wasn't most of the medieval world fragmented at that point because it's ran by barons? You know, I don't know. Love to know what people's interpretation is. Anyway, that's just my criticism. Hopefully I wasn't too harsh, but I think it's important to get that criticism out there, especially when it's giving a form of history that I feel is very incorrect. I don't think it was the worst video out there. There is definitely worse out there. And if you want me to review any videos, definitely send it and comment below. And definitely give your interpretation and comments as well. I'd love to delve in deeper to your interpretation of Irish medieval history. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. Obviously, this Sunday, I'm back over on Patreon doing my classes again. If you want to just support the channel, there's no problems there. There's plenty of people doing that. And even just watching the videos gets that job done with the old like and subscribe. But regardless, if you're into having more meat, this week we're starting the Brian Baru classes for this month. So definitely head on Join for about 20 quid, and come on, every Sunday we're covering the Viking Age in Ireland, and these are the times below. So if you're interested in any of that, definitely head over to the old Patreon there at Irish Medieval History and join the classes. Other than that, guys, thanks very much, and slán go bhfuaile.